let's take a look at the signs of the trig function. This is very important and always a great concern for errors. You really have to pay attention to in which quadrant your angle is located, and based on the quadrants, your trig functions have different signs. So it's really important that you understand that. So we're going to practice which quadrant we're in, and then we're actually looking at a problem where we find the remaining trig functions based on the location in which quadrant this problem here is located. But before we do that, we need to understand the signs of the individual trig function. So we know we have Q1 here, quadrant 1, and we go counterclockwise, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. Now in quadrant 1, all trig functions are actually positive. So the sine, the cosecant, the cosine, the secant, the tangent, and the cotangent, just let me write it like this, they are all positive. So all 6 trig functions, if we had to evaluate them in quadrant 1, are positive. And I'm going to write all here for a reason. I'll tell you in a second. Now let's go to quadrant 2. In quadrant 2, only the sine and its reciprocal, the cosecant, are positive. So these are the only 2 trig functions that are positive in quadrant 2. The rest, cosecant, secant, tangent, cotangent, are negative. They are negative located in quadrant 2, and that makes sense because we have a negative x here, and if you remember, the cosine is the x coordinate of an ordered pair, so the cosine would be negative. And since the tangent is sine over cosine, if you have a negative here, the tangent has to be negative as well. Okay, in quadrant 3, let me just explain this again. We have a negative x value and we have a negative y value. So the tangent is, by definition, is y over x, so negative divided by negative. Hence, you guessed it, the tangent and its reciprocal are positive in quadrant 3. The rest of the story is negative. So the sine, cosecant, the cosine, and the secant, all 4 of them are negative. Now, the sine not the sine as in S-I-G-N, oh, sine. The sine situation in quadrant 4 is positive on the x-coordinate, negative on the y-coordinate. So negative on the y-coordinate, well, what does that mean? That means that the sine and the cosecant are negative. If it's positive on the x-coordinate, what was the definition? Which trig function was the x-coordinate? 2 seconds. Cosine. So cosine and secant in quadrant 4 are positive, and that also means that the tangent and the cotangent in quadrant 4 are negative. Oops, minus sign. Okay, so actually a different color. We have all trig functions in quadrant 1 are positive. In quadrant 2, only the sine function is positive. And of course, the reciprocal, it's understood, but I'm just going with the main one, which is the sine. In quadrant 3, the tangent is positive, and in quadrant 4, the cosine is positive. Now, where am I going with this? There's a little mnemonic where you can memorize, hopefully, which trig function is positive in which quadrant. So let me just write this out. All in quadrant 1, S, all students, S for sign, T for take or tangent, all students take C for calculus. So that's how you remember which trig function is positive in which quadrant. All students take calculus, C for cosine. And don't you forget it, all students take calculus. Let's take a look at an example. The sine of theta is 1/3, and the cosine is negative or is less than 0. Which quadrant are we in? The sine is positive, but the cosine is negative. Okay? I give you 2 seconds by my watch. We're done. We are located, the sine is positive in quadrant 2 and the cosine is negative, so we are in Q2. The other one, the tangent is negative 3/4 and the sine is less than 0, meaning also negative. So the sine and the tangent are both negative. That brings us to Q4. Quadrant 4. I hope this makes sense. Now, let's have a problem. Okay, what did I say? What do I always say? Make yourself a little sketch. The cosine of theta is negative 1/3, and our theta is located between pi over 2 and pi. 0, pi over 2, 90 degrees, and pi, we're right here. So that means our angle is in what? Which quadrant? Q2, somewhere right here. Okay, that is our angle. What we can form now is a right triangle, and this angle is called the reference angle, which I explained earlier. Now we have a negative 1/3. So adjacent over hypotenuse. So this side is the hypotenuse, this is 3, and the adjacent to this angle here is -1, which makes sense because we are in Q2. So first of all, before you can find the remaining 4 trig functions, you need to find the opposite. Why did I say 4, not 5? Well, one's given, and if the cosine is given, I have no problems finding the secant, which is the reciprocal. The reciprocal of negative 1/3 is negative 3/1, or just negative 3. Okay, we're down to 4. Okay, let's find the opposite side. Opposite squared plus a negative 1 squared is 3 squared. Okay. O squared plus 1 equals 9. Subtract 1. Opposite squared is 8. And now we take the square root, and the opposite side is the square root of 8, which can be simplified as 2 square root of 2. Where's that coming from? Well, 8 can be factored into 4 times 2, and the square root of 4 is indeed 2, but the square root of 2 cannot be simplified. So the opposite side is 2 square root of 2. Okay, we're on business now. What is the sine of theta? The sine of theta, we are in quadrant 1, it better be positive, which we have a positive y value here. So the opposite is 2 square root of 2 all over 3. Done you are. The cosecant of theta is the reciprocal which is 3 over 2 square root of 2. Now we have to rationalize this denominator again. Multiply by the square root of 2, numerator and denominator, which leaves us with 3 square root of 2 over 2 times 2, which is 4. Square root of 4 is 2 times 2 is 4. Okay? Tangent. Tangent of theta is opposite over adjacent. So we are in quadrant 2. Quadrant 2, the tangent has been negative. Don't forget that. 2 square root of 2 over, well, maybe I should write it like that. Over negative 1, so here you go, it's definitely negative, which is the same as negative 2 square root of 2. You don't have to, you can write it like that. The cotangent of theta is also negative, negative 1 over 2 square root of 2. We need to multiply by the square root of 2, which is negative square root of 2 over 4. Here you go, done you are. That's how you find the remaining trig functions. Make sure that all students take calculus. Watch your signs.